So I've been waiting 3 months to share these books with you because in my mind, winter and fantasy go hand in hand. I don't know why, I just think they do. So whether you're looking for an epic story, a snowy aesthetic, a tropical escape, or something completely unique, I got you covered. I've broken the video up into 3 sections. Number 1, stellar series. Number 2, dynamic duos, or duologies. And number 3, standout standalones. I also have a small section of honorable mentions that have really come from you. These are books that many of you have championed and said these are absolutely perfect for a winter read. So I guess technically this is more than 11 books. And some of these books may be familiar to you, but I guarantee at least 1 or 2 are probably going to be brand new that you maybe have never heard of before. Either way, I hope this list inspires you to find a few new books that you can add to your winter reading list. First up, we have one of my favorite fantasy series that I've read in the last few years, and that's the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne. The Bloodsworn Saga follows warring clans, ancient monsters, and a land shaped by Norse myth. The story manages to mix political tensions and the threat of rising creatures, and just the very aspects of how to survive in a harsh environment. And it's all centered around a cast that carry deep scars and loyalties and kind of conflicting motives. One of the reasons I enjoy this series so much is because of John Gwynne's writing. I think he is masterful, not just at propulsive action and combat and fights. What he really shines with is this deep sense of honor and family and heart. So while this story has some brutality and some things that are just gut punches, there are such strong through lines of honor and hope that you just want to keep reading. And then when you couple that with the incredible world building and the incredible character dynamics that Gwynne achieves with his story, it's just kind of a no-brainer. These aren't small books, they're pretty hefty, but I would say they fly by. And the audiobooks are just as good as the physical books. So if you do immersion reading where you listen and read at the same time, this is a great collection of stories to do that with. Or if you're reading at one point and you have to switch over to an audiobook, the momentum continues to carry regardless of how you are consuming or interacting with the story. The world feels pretty harsh in these books, but also very grounded and very real. It's full of messy relationships and broken pasts and hurt and scars and loss and grief and hope. And there's this mythic lore that is just seamlessly kind of interwoven into the everyday lives of the characters. So again, while there's violence, you're always able to find emotional purpose behind it. It's not just gratuitous, and it's not just to bring the reader down or to show how terrible the world is. One of the things that I find interesting about this particular saga is that I will often hear people say that this is grim or grimdark, and I would push back against that. I don't think this is grimdark at all. It can be grim, certainly, but there's a surprising amount of warmth throughout this story. Even in the chaos of battle, even with the depth of loss that certain characters experience or the complexity of the emotions and the relationships, there's still just a deep level of warmth and heart that permeate every chapter. Now, all of the books on this list may not work for everyone, so I want to be able to kind of just pinpoint a little bit some of the things that may not work for certain people. And with these books, I would say it's a pretty large roster of characters, and sometimes depending on the mood that you're in, having a really large cast of characters can just seem a little bit daunting. They're also not slim books, and even though they read fast, the idea of that many pages can sometimes also seem a little bit overwhelming to any reader. Also, there are a lot of Norse and Nordic names, and so if you don't know how to pronounce those, or if you don't have an audiobook to kind of clue you in as to the correct pronunciation, that might draw you out of the story unless you do a little bit of research, to kind of figure out how to say some of the names or places that are mentioned in the book. But really, that's just me nitpicking. I love these books, and I really want everybody to read them. So who are these books for? I would say the Bloodsworn Saga is perfect for readers who enjoy or want epic battles, interesting mythology, deep heartfelt bonds, gritty action, great world building, but is still character driven. If that's the type of story or stories that you like, definitely give these a go. There's no way I can do a fantasy list for winter without talking about the Winternight Trilogy. This trilogy tells the story of Vasha, a girl who can see beings from old Russian folklore, these creatures that many others believe are just superstitions or don't exist. As the world around Vasha begins to change and different political machinations and just modernity begin to take root, fear really begins to tighten its grip around the souls of the people around Vasha. And this gift that she has becomes not just a curse, but also a blessing and even her greatest strength. This trilogy is one of the most beautifully written trilogies I've read in this type of setting. It has this folklore feel, but with real stakes and a lot of great character depth. Catherine Arden, who's the author, writes winter as if it is a character in of itself. It's cold, beautiful, mysterious, and even deadly. There's this beautiful integration of Slavic folklore that really helps dig even deeper into the roots of the story, that just draws you in and allows you to really get lost in the tale. I also think Vasha's journey is one that's just really interesting, because as she discovers what it means to have this gift, it also just brings up natural questions for her about, what does freedom really look like? What about identity? What is the true cost of not conforming to what the people around you think you should be or how you should act? The story often feels very intimate, but still a little bit grand in scale, which I really appreciated. One of the things that may not work for people is that the pacing is pretty slow. Like, it's consistent, but it is very intentionally kind of not meandering exactly, but the pacing is just, very evenly paced, even though it's a slower pace, if that makes sense. And one of the reasons for that is that mood is a very important aspect to these stories. And so there's a lot of attention given to just creating the mood and setting that kind of place setting of the mood, as well as the characters' various introspective moments as they think and process all the different realities and things that they are facing or have faced. So who are these books for? I would say this trilogy is for any reader who is looking for rich, moody, atmospheric, grounded, coming-of-age story arc type of tales. One that has deep and interesting roots in folklore and also some really beautiful prose. So if that's your vibe, definitely give these three a read. And then finally in section 1, I have the Chronicles of Narnia. I love the Chronicles of Narnia. And this is what's interesting, I think, about this series, is that many people probably have read these stories before, or at least The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, maybe The Magician's Nephew, or The Horse and His Boy. But most people have read either a good chunk of the entire series or the entire series. The problem is that most of us have read these when we were much younger. And I think we miss the beauty and genius of C.S. Lewis as an author, because although these are children's stories, there is so much more depth and philosophy, and yes, religious allegory, that are interwoven into the story. But when you read them as an adult, they just hit and land completely differently in a way that really makes you appreciate them on such a deep level that you probably never even expected before. Now, if you've never read the Chronicles of Narnia before, let me just give you a real brief synopsis. Essentially, the Chronicles of Narnia follow the story of children who enter the magical world of Narnia, which is a land shaped by prophecy and ancient magic and moral battles between good and evil. In each of the 7 books, and they're all short books, explore a different moment in Narnia's history. And the last book, The Last Battle, as an adult reading that book, it hits in the feels. Just gets you in the feels. I think one of the things that makes Narnia so great is that besides the nostalgic factor, which that is obviously a factor with these stories, but Narnia endures because it's approachable and simple, yet really profound. Lewis captures childlike wonder like very few people are able to do, at least certainly up to that point. And each story has this sense of adventure and humor and meaning that still really resonates today. This series is a series much like The Lord of the Rings, much like another book later on in this video, that many modern fantasy authors will point to as inspiration, as foundational and formative for their own childhood or imaginations or even their writing process. And for good reason. Now, this is one of my favorite series of all time, but there are still some things that may not work for some people. And I totally get that. And I think one of those things is that there are certain elements of the story that just reflect a very different time, and sometimes that's a little bit more challenging for our modern sensibilities to really lock into or connect to. And the fact that these are children's stories, sometimes we have a little bit of a chip on our shoulders as adults where we go, I don't really see the value in reading children's stories, which I always want to push back on because I think there's incredible and intrinsic value in kind of rediscovering the joy of childhood no matter how old we are. But who is this series for? Honestly, I'd say anybody. Just anybody. If you enjoy reading, if you enjoy fantasy, if you enjoy being reminded of good and hopeful things in the world, this is a fantastic and wonderful series to read. At any age, really at any time of year. But I do find that I'm always drawn to this series in the winter for some reason. And I don't think it's just because The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe happens kind of in a snowy setting the entire time. Just the entire series makes me want to read it in the winter. So if you've never read it before, I hope you read it. And if you haven't read it in a long time, I hope you read it. Because you know what? Still slaps. Truly does. All right, let's head into section 2, perfect pairings or duologies. And I have 2 different duologies that I want to share with you today. And these are 2 different duologies that I don't really hear many people talking about that often, and I don't know many people at all that have ever read them. So I'm super excited to share them with you. The first one is the Initiate Brothers. These 2 books unfold in an Asian-inspired empire where religious orders and political factions and all kinds of mystical forces collide. The story follows a young group of initiatives that have to deal with all their training as their training intersects with kind of this brewing political instability and just spiritual upheaval. Now, this is one of those series that I think rewards the reader when you read it carefully and thoughtfully. And that's not to say that I think these stories are boring. They're not at all. I think they're actually really engaging. But there's quite a bit of depth in the sentence structure and even how the story is told that just, I think, allows for you to rest in the story a little bit, and you're just as richly rewarded for it when you're able to do that. I love the fact that it blends martial arts and philosophy and political intrigue and an interesting magic system and religious ideas. And really, these were written a good while ago, and so it feels like a lot of the things that these books do were a bit ahead of their time. The tone is a bit contemplative, which I think really matches just the aesthetic of the story itself. And the world building it just feels really precise and intentional. And it has this kind of, the only way I know how to say it is this structural cleverness that older fantasy, I think, did really, really well, that sometimes we don't always see, or maybe we take for granted now in more modern fantasy stories. Now, as much as I love these 2 books, I very much understand that they're not necessarily going to work for everyone, especially if you're not used to reading older fantasy, because again, there are some pacing issues. And by pacing issues, I don't mean that it's meandering or anything. It's just very consistent at one even pace that is just a lot slower than a lot of modern fantasy typically reads. So who are these 2 books for? I would say these books are for anyone who is a fan of political fantasy, martial arts, monastic settings, and really layered plots. Our second duology is the Lighthouse Duology by Carol Berg. And Carol Berg is an author that hardcore fantasy readers know who she is and have probably read at least some of her books. A lot of more modern fantasy readers may have never read anything by her, or people that only know kind of the really best-selling fantasy novels and different things like that. They may have never discovered her before, but the Lighthouse Duology, I personally love it. It's different. It feels a bit different. It reads a bit different, but I think that's one of the reasons that I like it. This duology basically follows a man whose entire understanding of himself begins to unravel after he's taken by a secluded order tasked with protecting long-hidden magic. As he uncovers buried truths, he becomes entangled in a conflict that is way bigger than himself and way bigger than anything he could have ever imagined. I think Carol Berg is a master at character psychology. Like, she writes internal conflict with such incredible nuance. And though her protagonist is dealing with questions of identity, of who he is, of who do people think he is, or who does he think he himself is, and as he's also wrestling with his own pain and baggage and all the things that have caused him hurt, the author just layers over and under and through all these various moral quandaries that really invite the reader to have to wrestle through as well, making the story feel, I don't know, just really deeply relatable in a way that I just would have never expected from a story like these 2 books. I think the setting in these 2 books is kind of haunting. The mystery is compelling, and I think the emotional payoff is really substantial, and I love it when there is emotional payoff at the end of a story. I always like a good wrapped up story. I like mysteries to be solved. I don't need the ending of the book to always stick the landing for me to enjoy everything that came before it, but this is one of those sets of books that by the end of it, I was just like, yeah, I really enjoyed the payoff for that. Now, again, this is another set of stories, and if you like plot-driven things, I promise I do have some plot-driven things coming up. But this is another one of those stories where plot takes the backseat a little bit, and really it's the character development and the character arc that is the most important thing and the thing that's always in the foreground. So who are these books for? I would say this duology is for anyone who likes character-driven fantasy, as well as stories with real emotional depth and I think a satisfying payoff. Because really, I think these 2 books I would classify as just kind of thoughtful storytelling. And I definitely think they're worth a read. All right, before we get to the final section, I want to give some honorable mentions. And again, these honorable mentions have really come from all of you. You have like championed these stories. And some of these I've actually added to my winter TBR for this coming year, which I'm pretty excited about. So I'm going to read the notes off of this one because I just don't know much about these stories. First up is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, which is a dark folkloric fantasy inspired loosely by Rumpelstiltskin. So that's interesting. Following three young women whose lives collide with fey bargains, political tension, and a wintry kingdom threatened by an icy magical force. Sounds like a good time. Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams, which is a pretty well-known series and to my understanding was pretty influential for George R.R. Martin and A Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire. This is a pretty foundational epic fantasy trilogy about a young kitchen boy pulled into a realm spanning conflict involving political upheaval, ancient enemies, and a world on the brink of ruin. Awesome. So these three books I have added to my winter TBR and I'm pretty excited. I like to read things that ended up being kind of hugely impactful or inspirational for other authors. I just always think it's really interesting. Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. It's a historical fantasy wrapped in, again, folklore and mystery. I think folklore and winter really go well together. When a seemingly drowned child miraculously returns to life in a riverside tavern, several families claim her, and the truth becomes a story woven with magic and myth. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This has been on my list for a while. I have not read it. I read Piranesi for the first time this year and absolutely adored it. So this just immediately made my list. But this is a really thick book. I know it's a really thick book. It's an alternate history fantasy set in 19th century England where two magicians revive English magic, creating political intrigue, uneasy alliances, and eerie encounters with fae. So sounds great, and I've heard it's beautifully written. I can't wait to read this one. Like I'm really stoked about that one. And then finally, The Sword of Kaigen, which I know is one of the best standalones that it's ever been written, at least from my understanding, and I very much look forward to reading that book. That is on my January TBR for this coming year. And I feel like everyone I know has read this book except for me. So I'm pretty excited to read A Sword of Kaigen, even though everyone has also told me that I'm going to be really sad and devastated. So, you know, great time for a January read. If you're like me, though, and you haven't read The Sword of Kaigen, let me tell you what it's about. Sword of Kaigen is a character-driven military fantasy set in a mountainous empire threatened by invasion, and the story follows a mother confronting her buried past and a son discovering the truth of his nation's lies, all against a backdrop of elemental magic and apparently very intense battles, and again, some sadness. And then finally, our last section, Standout Standalones. And first up, we have Where the Waters Turn Black. This follows a young storyteller who forms a bond with a mischievous sea creature. It's set in this Polynesian-inspired world that is just filled with vibrant mythology and island culture. And the story and the journey really explore these ideas of creativity and courage and belonging, which are some of my favorite things to explore. I think the sense of place of this story is one of the reasons why I love it so much and why it feels so unforgettable. To be fair, I am someone who wants to have my own like tiki club and tiki palace. I'm fascinated by Polynesian culture and Polynesian history, and so the setting and place setting of this story is just really interesting to me. But even in the book, it's just done really, really well, and it feels lived in and feels very tangible. And honestly, is kind of like a nice warm escape from the wintry realities that many of us face in January, February, and March. Now, this book is a part of the broader Tales of Kikon stories and world, but this is still very much a standalone book and can be enjoyed on its own. The things that might not work for people is that this is, I don't want to say this is like Legends and Lattes, but this does border on cozy fantasy, but in a very different way because you're in a tropical locale. But the stakes are just lower. It doesn't mean that things aren't happening. The pacing, I think, is actually really good in the story. It doesn't feel slow, like it's always moving forward, but there's something about the story that the stakes are just, you know, lower than maybe an epic fantasy. I would say this book is for anyone who likes that tropical vibe, but also enjoys kind of that cozy feel, that more relaxing tone, consistent pacing, gentle magic, and mythic creatures, because there are mythic creatures, which I always think is fun. Now for this next story, I want to see if you can guess what the book is off the description I'm going to give you. This standalone follows a respectable town that tries desperately to suppress anything magical until fairy influence returns and begins unraveling their carefully curated and maintained order. Do you know what it is? Let me give you a clue. This is one of the most foundational fantasy stories ever written and predates The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. This is Blood in the Mist. Blood in the Mist is equal part whimsical and unsettling. I think. It's a meditation on imagination as well as repression and kind of the unavoidable pull of the unknown. It reads like a fairy tale for adults because that's kind of exactly what it is. I think one of the most fascinating things about Blood in the Mist to me is that most kind of hardcore fantasy readers I know have at least heard of Blood in the Mist, but very few of them have actually read it, let alone people that are new to the fantasy genre or just kind of becoming and discovering their love of reading. And I think that's really a shame. Yes, it reads maybe a little bit more difficult than what we're used to today because the language is just different and the prose can feel, I don't know if opaque is the best word, but like it's just a different kind of pacing. It's a different kind of storytelling because of the era that it was written in. But there's so much richness in the story, and the story itself is actually really good. But the fact that this was so foundational for nearly every other fantasy writer to come after this book, I think is one of the reasons why it is just a must read for any fantasy fan. And I think wintertime is the perfect time to read this book and read this story. And much like Agatha Christie with modern mystery or thriller novels, once you read Blood in the Mist, you will be able to see the fingerprints of this story in almost every fantasy book that you read that is modern and of today. But again, let me be honest, one of the things that might not work is the style of prose that it's written in, because it is just different. But this is a book that I think is for any fantasy fan, truly. If you're a fantasy fan, if you're a fantasy reader, regardless of the type or subgenre that you like, you should read this book. I've been toying with the idea of starting a book club for the channel, and I really thought if I was to do it, I think I would want Blood in the Mist to be the very first book that we would do, because I just think it's so foundational. So if that's something that you might be interested in, let me know. If there's interest out there, I'm definitely game to do it. Let me know down in the comments below if that's something you'd be down for and something you'd be interested in. All right, let's keep moving. Next up is the Book of Lost Things. A grieving boy enters a sinister fairy tale world filled with really terrible and distorted versions of familiar stories. But each encounter forces him to face his fears, his grief, and to ultimately be honest about his longing for connection. This is such an emotionally rich and thematically layered story. The fairy tale components and the fairy tale elements of this story are not comforting. They're really symbolic and they're challenging, and they're deeply tied to the protagonist's inner life, which as the reader kind of becomes tied to our internal lives. But it balances the darkness with just this deep amount of hope, which I, again, just always love. This is written by John Connolly, who's mostly known for kind of crime fiction, but I think because of that, it gives this fantasy story a bit of a darker and sharper edge than most people would probably expect. There's not a lot for me that doesn't work in this novel. I will say though, if you are looking for something much more cozy or with low stakes, or that's not necessarily emotionally complex, you probably don't want to read this, because this really does hit on some deep things and just deep realities of insecurity and hurt and pain, fears, and all the things in between. And so if that's too heavy for you, this may not be the best book to read during winter. Just also know kind of your own boundaries and where you're at in your own headspace. I do, however, think this book is for anyone who likes kind of that dark fairy tale vibe, or who like those coming of age stories and those introspective narratives. This is a book I recommend pretty often to people, and most of the individuals that have read it have come back and told me how much they really enjoyed it. But I mean, it's all subjective, so you may read it and not like it at all. I just want to tell you about it because I really like it. All right, our second to last book is The Wolf Wilder. And this book is a little bit of a cheat because it's not really true fantasy. It's much more magical realism, and it's middle grade reading, and I don't care because it's by Catherine Rundell. And if you've watched any of my videos, you know I'm a big fan of Catherine Rundell, who, if you don't know who she is, she's probably best known right now for the Impossible Creatures series of children's books that she's written. There's 2 out. They're just beautiful and they're great, and she's a wonderful author. And this is a book that she wrote, I think, maybe 4 or 5 years before Impossible Creatures came out. But this story follows a rebellious girl who trains domesticated wolves to be wild again, hence the title of the book. When her world is threatened, she embarks on a dangerous journey through a frozen wilderness with her wolves by her side. And it's awesome. Here's the thing about Catherine Rundell and why I just really enjoy her books, even though I'm an adult, including her nonfiction books, because she's actually written several nonfiction books. Her writing is just so beautiful and so engaging. And this story is filled with that kind of quiet bravery is kind of the best way I know how to describe it. There's a lot of humor, there's deep themes of loyalty, but it also feels like kind of a classic adventure story. The wolf-human bond is really handled, I think, with a lot of care and respect. And the setting feels magical, even though it doesn't necessarily rely on fantasy elements. The only reason why I think this book might not work for some people is because it's technically children's literature, and sometimes people are just like, I don't see the value in reading that. I think the other thing is if you're looking for like a fully fleshed out magic system or something like that that's much more traditional fantasy, you might be disappointed. But if you're looking for something that feels magical, that has magical realism and a great story with a ton of heart and that really reads at a really nice pace with beautiful prose, you're gonna like the book. So whether that's for you as an adult, or maybe you have a kid or a grandchild or a niece or nephew, this is also just a great story to be able to read with them or even to gift to them, because there's just so much good stuff in it, and I guarantee they're gonna like it. And I have a good bet that you'll like it as well. All right, our last book is one that some people don't call fantasy. They refer to it as horror. Others will say it's something completely different. Personally, I think it's dark fantasy. I think there's definitely horror elements, and because this author is known for horror, I think people just want to kind of put it in that category. But I would argue this is dark fantasy. And I'm talking about Stephen King's The Stand. I'm a big Stephen King fan. I've read more than half of his novels. And while my favorite is The Shining, I would say out of all the books that I've read of his, I do think The Stand is probably his best work. It is also incredibly long and chunky. The premise is a bit dark, but I think that's why it fits well in winter. It also, the end of the book kind of is in a wintry setting as well, so it just, in my brain, naturally draws together. But The Stand is really all about this. After a global plague wipes out most of humanity, the survivors are drawn into a large-scale struggle between the forces of good and evil. The story spans dozens of characters, multiple regions, and moral choices with legitimate world-shaping consequences. When I say that I think this is Stephen King's best work, I really mean it, because it's not just the quality of the writing or the thoughtfulness and all the different through lines. He subverts a lot of expectations in the story. There are moments where you are left almost in shock that he made the narrative decision that he made. It's also an incredibly ambitious book. But above all that, the character work is incredibly rich, and the thematic stakes just feel so immense. The mix of realism and horror and fantasy create such a uniquely immersive reading experience that might feel daunting because of how big and complex it is, but is so rewarding. It is why this book has stood the test of time. It's also why a lot of Stephen King fans will point to this as their favorite book, because you're with these characters and in this situation and in this story for so long, and discovering so many different layered aspects that King has very meticulously built in, that when the story's finally over, you still kind of feel like you're living in it. And you end up thinking about it way more than you probably would ever realize that you are. So there are a few things that this might not work for some people. Number one is that it's long. I mean, it's really long. It is a take your time over a month, maybe two, maybe the entire winter, and take your time reading the book. It's that long. I think another thing that might not work for some people is that there are a few sections that might feel a little dated, and sometimes our brains don't always know how to kind of work around that. And then finally, it leans heavily into dystopian horror and fantasy vibes, and so because of that, there's a bleakness that just kind of exists throughout the story. Again, though, there is very much a through line of hope and redemption. There really is, like, it's ultimately a story about good versus evil, and just kind of the moral complexity of humanity, of how we as individuals deal with that. But again, that bleakness might just feel a little bit too heavy for you personally at this time, or it just may be something that you're not necessarily ever interested in, and that's totally fine. So who's this book for? I would say this book is for any reader who enjoys rich, dark, grounded epics that really manage to highlight the true complexity of what it means to be good or what it means to be evil, and really the consequences of not just our actions, but also the thoughts that kind of lead to our actions. I also think this is a great book for anyone who enjoys stories that explore multiple genres within its pages, and for anyone that really kind of likes the idea of a larger cast in multiple locations, because it just makes the story feel a lot bigger and grander and more epic in a way that still somehow feels relatable, this is definitely a story for you. And I understand you may be in the this is straight up horror. You let me know down in the comments. We could disagree. I'm okay with that. Okay, whether it's a series, a duology, or a standalone, I hope you found a few new books to add to your TBR, or maybe rediscovered an old favorite that you've been reminded of I should pick that up again. Either way, this is a list of books that I really do believe in are great to get lost in through the winter season. If you've read any of these books, let me know down below and what you thought of them, or maybe which books you plan to add to your TBR, or even what are some books that maybe should have been on this list that aren't. And if you're not looking for any winter specific books, but you're looking for maybe some fast-paced fantasy stories, then take a look at this video right here. I think you'll find some really great fast-paced fantasy novels that will just scratch that itch when you don't want to spend a ton of time reading, but you still want to get lost in story. All right, as always, my name is Topher. Stay curious, read deeply, and I'll see you in the library. Oh, and stay warm, unless you live in a tropical locale. And then don't rub it in.